My name is Scott Challoner, and you are listening to the Leaders Council podcast for the people who run the country and the people who keep the country running. As regular listeners of our programme will know very well, part of our mission here at the Leaders Council is to bring you a variety of distinct perspectives on leadership, and to this end, I'm delighted to welcome Mark Wilson, CEO and Managing Partner at Wilson Fletcher, onto today's programme. Wilson Fletcher is a business innovation consultancy that helps grow digital companies. Mark, very warm welcome to yourself, and thanks for joining us.
Morning, Scott. Thank you for having me.
Good morning to you, Mark. And it's a very busy time, isn't it, at Wilson Fletcher? And I believe a congratulations is in order because it is the 20th anniversary of the business, I believe I'm right in saying.
It is this week, yes. We set up, I think Steph and I did our first day's work on the company. I think it was either this day or tomorrow, 20 years ago. So, yes, it's quite a milestone for an independent business like ours.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And with regards to what it is that you specialise in, I suppose I've given the very concise version of exactly what it is that you do. So just to kind of set the scene for the listeners that may not be familiar with the business, what would you say your specialism is in your own words?
Sure. We fundamentally, we're a business innovation company. And what that means is we help organisations of all shapes and sizes use new ideas, new strategies to bring new propositions to life in market, or to adapt their business to the prevailing needs of the digital economy. So sometimes that is redesigning the entire organisation and rethinking how the organisation. A lot of the times it's helping them develop a new product or service or a new venture that will allow them to open up entirely new marketplaces, reach new customers, and we have a particular focus on helping people reach their future customer. So there's a lot of our work is centered around modeling who you might be serving in 2-3 years' time, how their behaviors will change, and what kinds of services and products you can design for them to enable entirely new behaviors or to serve them for where they will be at that point, rather than to just try and meet the needs of now when they reach that point in the future.
Yeah, certainly makes sense from my perspective. With regards to sort of the backstory behind the business, of course, we've established that the business is 20 years older this week. Did you know sort of prior to 2002 then that maybe going into business for yourself and starting a venture like this was going to be the way forward for you?
To some extent, yes. I mean, I've been in the digital world for, God, this is a confession, something like 33 years now. So I'm a grey hair in this business, so I've largely operated in this domain, and I think this is the third company that I've kind of led over that time. So yes, it's always been part of my DNA in lots of ways. I trained as an architect originally, and that kind of design. Underlying kind of design ethos has always been part of the work that I've done. So yes, I think right from a very early age, I saw the digital domain as being somewhere that I could really enjoy, doing the kind of work that I do.
And what would you say sort of early on in your career were some of the fundamental lessons that you learned when it came to sort of building business? Just because we do have a lot of younger sort of entrepreneurially minded people that do tend to tune into this and may have sort of that idea themselves, but may not necessarily know exactly where to start with it.
I think that's a great question. I think if I could have written myself a letter in the past, I think I probably would have advised myself to get more advice. I think it's one of those things that you don't really see the path ahead of you as clearly as other people might see it. But I think there are endless lessons in the world that you can learn from others who've experienced them already. And I certainly learned some incredibly valuable lessons from more experienced colleagues and friends, and many clients that we've had over the years who might have been CEOs of major companies or who have been on kind of fast growth paths with their own businesses. And the lessons that they impart, the things that you learn from other people's experiences are, I think, among the most valuable things that you can ever take on as a business leader. So I would say, cast your net widely and gather as many views and get as much kind of diverse input into your thinking about, particularly if you're a young company, as you possibly can.
Yeah, certainly very good advice from my perspective, because the future is something that we don't necessarily think about an awful lot at times, and we can't always see into the future. Sometimes we're guilty of assumption, but when it comes to the digital space, I suppose future proofing is a buzzword that comes up quite a lot at the moment. Yeah. And we're seeing a lot of sort of business leaders, CEOs, directors starting to sort of rethink their strategies towards future proofing and future growth. And that, according to a great many commentators, has actually brought a radical shift in priorities for various business leaders. Certainly so since COVID and since the emergence of the current economic situation we find ourselves in. So from your perspective, Mark, working with business leaders quite closely, what are some of the key elements that they're thinking about right now, or certainly that they ought to be thinking about?
I think you've raised a good point, actually, in raising the future-proofing aspect of things. We have a different philosophy on this, and this is something that I've felt very passionately about for years. I think we call it future making, and I think the reason for that is that when you look at some of the biggest changes that we've seen in the services we use and how we interact with the world over the last 10, 15 years in particular, those have been initiatives that people wouldn't have said that they wanted. They wouldn't have identified them as pain points necessarily. But as soon as something came along that gave them a new, better capability or a new way to behave than they'd had before, they jump on them and they adopt them. So I think when organizations are thinking about conceptually thinking about future-proofing themselves, what they really should be thinking about is how to build new positions or new behaviours in the people that they serve, and that's whether they're a government or whether they're a 2-week-old startup, that really kind of allow them to own that future agenda. And when we talk about future, we're really talking about a few years hence. This is not, people shouldn't be engaging in much long-term stargazing, because it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to plot those sorts of future patterns. But it's very possible to jump a few years down the line, and we typically use a 3-year horizon, and say, right, what should we be now? What could we be offering? What could we be doing that we couldn't do 3 years ago? We'll often run exercises with business leaders where we'll ask them to design the business 3 years hence that put their business out of business. And it's a great exercise to go through, because it forces you to think about how you would do things really differently, and what you needed to get to then look back to figure out what changes you'd made along the way. And what very often happens is that when people design that future business or that future service, they then look at their current organisation and go, I think we probably should be doing that now. Why are we doing these things? Why are we still doing these things that we're doing today if we really don't believe that they are what will give us, our kind of best?
And you raise an important point there about sort of not looking too far ahead into the future, because there are things on the horizon that quite often we don't see coming, and I think the COVID-19 pandemic was certainly a very, very good example of that. So I suppose when you are sort of making future planning, the key thing is to be able to keep the vision the same, but also to be able to innovate and adapt the plan as well, because if it doesn't survive first contact with the enemy, you've got to have that agility about you.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the pandemic was a great example of how often, sadly, adverse situations force changes on us. And I think when we look at how people's behaviour has changed since the pandemic, we're obviously seeing enormous changes and pressures on working behaviours, how people work, where they work, the times they want to work, and so on. But we've also seen an enormous amount of plasticity in how people think about things. So there are lots of things that people value more now than they did before the pandemic. So we've heard lots of people talking about, their enjoyment of open spaces, because obviously when we were all locked away, that became something that became very precious to people. And there were lots of innate behaviours that we saw change quite quickly. So I've used this anecdote a number of times, but if I'd said to an elderly relative that you would be talking about intimate details of your medical history on a video call, potentially even showing parts of yourself to a doctor on a phone, they would have said absolutely not. Obviously, over the course of the pandemic, there was no choice in many cases but to do those sorts of things, and it softened the boundaries for many people between what they would have allowed themselves to do in the past and what they had to do because of circumstances. And many of those changes, those enforced changes, have driven, I think, a lot of fluidity and plasticity in the way that people think about how they can do things these days. So they learn to trust that was something that was a good thing to do. And, now many people are electing to take a video appointment with a GP instead of an in-person appointment. So I think when we get those sorts of periods of dramatic change, or new capabilities are suddenly added, and we're seeing with artificial intelligence and services like open banking, there's all these things that happen behind the scenes that suddenly either encourage us to do new things or make them possible for the first time, and we look at them and go, actually that's something that I could really use, I could really do within my life, and I'll adopt it.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. And you talk about AI there, and things like AI in data, they're certainly some of the greatest resources that we have in business, aren't they? They make processes a lot quicker within our businesses. They also help us make sort of better decisions. But do you have to be conscious in the sense that when you're sort of using data especially, that you don't sort of base decisions too far ahead on the numbers that you're garnering from the here and now, because things are susceptible to change?
Yes, 100%. I mean, I'm a passionate advocate of not designing your future with your past, and that there are all sorts of indicators that you can use to assess how well your business is doing. Typically, not always, but typically, things like data and financial information are historic indicators. By the time you can see them, they've already happened, because the data's been collected, or you're reporting on the last quarter's results or whatever. So effectively what you're really doing there is you're always looking at a version of the past. What they can't tell you is what might happen if you did something quite different and quite new, or how people might respond to those things based on what you know of them today. So I think it's a very dangerous practice to infer that because something has happened up until now, because the data tells us that this thing is true or has been true up until now, that is how we should continue to plot our path into the future. And there were the big milestone disruption cases where if you take someone like Nokia back in the day, all of their research and all of their data, all of their insight told them that what people wanted were more reliable phones with longer battery life. And that was true. That is what people were telling them. As soon as Apple came along and launched the iPhone, and it gave people completely new capabilities, of which actually the phone was a pretty poor part of it, and the battery life was terrible. We all know what happened since. That whole marketplace exploded because people could do something new. They could, kind of take their lives with them in this little device that previous generation of devices had never managed to give them. So, in many of those cases, you get that kind of unexpected pattern change come about where if you just follow what looks like the logical conclusion, everybody else will arrive at the same place because they can all see those kind of logical patterns too. But B, when you get there may not be any customers left. All the people that you're looking to serve may have gone somewhere else entirely because actually they've been tempted to go in a very different path because somebody has launched something more progressive or more imaginative.
Yes, I suppose with logical thinking, it's kind of that you almost fall into the trap, don't you, of doing more of the same or just building on the same foundations. Whereas I suppose if you sort of think laterally versus logically, a term that you've of course used yourself before, that can then allow you to sort of build on what's already there in a much more innovative way, can't it?
Yes, I think it's you have to look for more diverse, broad influences. So when we're looking at what somebody's future could be like, we're often looking at the sectors around them. We'll almost never look at the area that they operate in. And there are really simple examples of this that everybody will be familiar with. So obviously, many people know and have used Uber. They understand that it's a completely frictionless taxi service. You book the car, you get in the car, you get out the car. There's no transaction because your card details are stored in the background. What people don't think about is that service probably never would have been possible had Amazon, over the previous years, not got people to be comfortable with storing their credit card details with a third party. Because and I'm old enough to remember the phases before this, but before that, people were actively encouraged not to leave their credit card details with a company. So those sorts of changes in one area will often enable a big shift in behaviour in another. We think one of the interesting ones at the moment is open banking. And again, there's a great savings service that many of us use, and I use one called Chip. And it's an AI-based savings tool. And if you'd asked me years ago, would I let a startup connect up to my bank account and take money out of it on a regular basis to put it in their account to hold for me as a savings pot, I'd have said absolutely not. But I do, and I've done it for years, and the service is actually really good. And there are many others like it where as we become comfortable with giving access to our bank accounts or any other aspects of the way that we operate our lives, new services can emerge that enable us to do things that we would never have been able to do before. So I think it's really exciting when you think about how many things are going on in the world, how many emerging technologies there are, and how many of those we might be able to turn into things that can, really significantly change for the better how people live and work.
And that's so important, isn't it? And this is where it gets incredibly clever, because when you're looking at external influences like that, it's not necessarily technologies that you can implement in your own business to make your product or offering better. It's also how those changes elsewhere are going to influence sort of consumer behaviour, because that ultimately is going to affect the market that you're targeting. And if you can better understand and cater to consumer behaviour, you're ultimately going to have a better business.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it applies in all aspects of life. Technology, and obviously, we're in an exponential technology age where things are changing and developing at exponential speed. And I think my view has always been that technology is an ingredient. It's never the whole dish. You don't use as a person AI. You use a service that is powered by aspects of machine learning or artificial intelligence. So it can inspire a dish, and that can be a reason for building that service, but it can equally just be a very small part of it and could be, one of many ingredients that are needed to make a service work. So I think when you're thinking about how the world is changing and when you're thinking about new technologies, it's critical not to think of them as the answer. They are a means to an end. They're an enabler. Sometimes they're a very large part of the concept behind the new service, and at other times they are a completely invisible thing that's ticking along in the background that's just making transactions faster or processes better or whatever. But it's another one of the things I'm often cautioning people about, that while we're in a highly sophisticated and exciting age of technology, those technologies on their own are not things that people can interact with. People need services and tools and products that technology can feed into, that will enable people to do new things or, as I said, live their lives in different ways.
Exactly right. And I suppose one dimension of it is, if you are a business that's going to be influenced by sort of those adjacent influences that we've talked about, you've got to understand how emerging technologies and new behaviours are going to affect your business, your target market. But I suppose if you're the innovator who is going to be disrupting the market and creating opportunities for other businesses, perhaps, I guess the the root of what you're doing is to try to influence or even invent sort of consumer behavior. You've got to come up with something that ultimately is going to change the way that people behave and essentially make a product appealing, because Airbnb is something that you sort of cited in a previous publication as a good example of that, in the sense that they looked at hotels are quite expensive, and they decided to make it easy for people to stay in other people's houses for a cheaper rate, basically, and that is their product.
Yes, and the interesting thing is that, again, if you'd framed that proposition to a consumer some years before, in the same way as if you said to people, would you be comfortable getting into a stranger's car late at night to be taken home? Would you be comfortable going and staying in somebody else's bedroom that you've never met in a far-off country? Most people would have reacted adversely to that. But when the service is put in front of them and it's thought through, and people start feeding back positive experiences of using it, then the snowball starts moving. And you start to see that people start adopting those services in much greater numbers, and then they become, what are apparently overnight successes, but obviously have often taken years to get to that point. So I do think that diversity and looking broadly is one of the most critical components. We're in the midst of developing a new advisory program. Because we found that there are many smaller companies who would really benefit from access to the kind of learnings and kind of experiences that we see from much bigger companies, but they can't get access to them easily, and they just can't plug into that broader knowledge. And we think there are endless experiences from surrounding sectors that can benefit everybody. So I think everybody should be looking broadly and trying to get as diverse a range of inputs as possible. And I suppose the other point to all of this is that none of it's any good without a vision. You've got to have a clear purpose to what you're doing. You need to know why you exist, and you need to be able to articulate a vision for the future that those ideas become a part of. So, Uber's underlying vision is actually about mobility. It's about moving people around and about moving things around. Arguably, a taxi service is just the first incarnation of what could become a very different philosophy for how people own or don't own vehicles.
It absolutely could, and it's about essentially not looking to solve sort of modern day problems, is it, that are there in the here and now. It's essentially just looking at opportunities and ways to disrupt and ways to change, because like I say, nobody would have thought that sort of Airbnb solution was essentially going to sort of solve a common problem of, well, hotels are sometimes in short supply and quite expensive. But like essentially it's something completely different that's just provided an alternative in the market, and it's done incredibly well as a result of that. So it's not necessarily just.
And there are some very expensive properties on Airbnb. It obviously when it started, it was about capacity and about providing low cost access to places to stay. But as it's evolved, there are properties on there that you can pay probably $10,000 a night for, in a luxurious location that would be more expensive than most hotels. So it's interesting how once you embed a new behaviour in a marketplace and you enable new things to happen, those things will naturally get a kind of a life of their own. And you'll see, because again, it's back to that thing about the kind of the plasticity of people, that once we get used to doing something new and we enjoy doing something new, and that might have been, a trip and staying, for lower cost initially for an Airbnb example, but over time, the familiarity of that process means that actually when we want to then go and do something that's much more of a treat or much more of a luxury, why wouldn't we turn to a mechanism that we really enjoy using instead of going back to those ones that we left behind?
Exactly right. These are all of the key things that you do need to be thinking about. And for anybody who is listening into the show today and does want to read a little bit more into Futurestate Design, as we've been talking about throughout this episode, Mark has published a book of his own that's available on Amazon. That's Futurestate Design: How to Step Out of the Past to Create a Business Fit for the Future. And that, Mark, outlines a lot of what we've talked about today, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And hopefully a gentle read. It's intended to be something that really just gets people to think differently about the things that they should design their future with and the things that they really shouldn't design their future with. And we've touched on some of them today. But we will always caution people from digging too deeply into their current operations before they start thinking about what to do next. We've for many years we've counselled people to do the opposite, because no matter what you do, the more you think about today, the more of that you will carry with you. We have this line that we use, that you won't find the future in a spreadsheet, but it still has to look good in one. So you've got to be prepared to invent, and you've got to do some things that may be illogical, and things that you can't immediately see how they would logically play out, in order to get to something further down the line, where when you look back at it, you say, well, why didn't we always do that? Or why didn't that always exist? And that's always the case with those real breakthrough innovations. They seem incredibly obvious and logical once you've found them, but the creation process of getting to them was anything but.
And it's the creation process that entrepreneurs really do need to be aware of, isn't it? Because these successes don't just happen overnight. They're not conceived, and they're not on the table for consumers in literally the click of a finger. It is something that requires so much dedication and so much research and so much thought. And I suppose in some senses that's the trap that we sometimes fall into. I think we crave that overnight success just that little bit too much.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that people don't reflect on, is that not many startups have a second idea. Startups are the product of innovation generally. So somebody's had a great idea, or they've come up with a new concept for something. The company, we just used to call them new businesses, but now they might be called a startup. The company's formed to realise that idea and to bring it to market. And people go out and raise money in all sorts of ways, or bootstrap it and get it out to market that way. But that company is a product of the invention process. And so very few of those companies that emerge from that process then go on to develop a second or a third innovative service. And that's partly because the way that venture capital works, where they'll try and get that company sold, but it's partly because actually those companies weren't built to generate ideas. They were built to execute an idea, and don't have the mechanisms in them to identify and bring new opportunities to market. And it's just a fascinating stat about startups, that they're actually some of the worst innovators as companies, because they are and should be in many cases kind of single-mindedly focused on executing the idea that they've been formed with to the best standard they can.
And I suppose that's where that agility comes in that we've talked about already, being able to essentially adapt the plan. The vision, of course, has to remain as such. I mean, the end goal is exactly pretty much what it is, but what you need to do is make sure that the strategy and the way that you get there can change and can adapt, of course, as we've spoken an awful lot about today. And something that we've spoken a great amount about on the programme today is the future, and all about how businesses can look to the future, step out of their past and head into sort of that pathway to success. And talking about the future with regards to your business, Mark, just before we do sort of wrap things up on the show today, I was wondering if you had any sort of big plans of your own for the upcoming year, and any milestones for sort of what you're doing and continuing to help business leaders really sort of let go of the past and move forward.
Yes, I mean we're doing a physician heal thyself thing. So we as we said at the beginning, we're 20 years old this week. There are very few businesses like ours that are independent who ever reach that milestone. So it's a great point for us to reach, but it's also a good time for us to change. So we're going to change our name. We're going to become the Futurestate Design Company. Futurestate Design is our kind of anchor methodology. It's the thing that everybody knows us for. And it gives us a new suit of clothes and a new philosophy, I suppose, for what we hope is the next 20 years. So we're going into next year with a view to we will continue to do the kind of high, intensive programs of work that we do with companies to help them develop new strategies and bring new products and services and ideas to life. But alongside that, we're spinning up this advisory program, which is a very low cost, light touch, supportive approach to helping smaller companies, newer companies, tap into a lot of that expertise that we've built from all of our work with hundreds of large companies over the years, to really help them avoid some of the big pitfalls that they might fall into, and take the good shortcuts. We often refer to them as the kind of the black cab shortcuts, the ones that you wish you knew before you set out on the journey. And there are so many of them where people just don't need to spend money on something or don't need to do a particular thing to get to the result they want, or can just avoid what is. We will often spot very early and say, if you go down that route, you'll end up driving into a cul-de-sac, and you'll have to turn around, and you'll have burnt quite a lot of fuel going down there. So for us next year, it's very much about positioning ourselves for, like I said, hopefully the next 20 years, and thinking about how we can help more and more companies become successful innovators, because we firmly believe, and we always have done, that the economy, particularly in the UK, where we have a very innovation-centric economy, I would say, we need to have as many companies in the marketplace bringing new ideas to market as we possibly can. So we're looking forward to trying to help as many of those do that as possible.
And it's absolutely fantastic what you're trying to do, and I certainly do wish you all the success in the world in really executing those goals and helping business leaders move forward and innovate and disrupt new marketplaces. And here is indeed to the next 20 years, hopefully. And I'd actually love the opportunity, Mark, to maybe even welcome you back onto the programme in future and catch up just to see how things are all coming together for you, and hopefully there'll be some real
Absolutely.
success.
Absolutely, delighted to.
Yeah, hopefully it'll be an opportunity to reflect on some real successes. And thank you again for taking the time to join us on the programme. And just a reminder to everybody out there, do look out for Mark's book on Amazon. That's Futurestate Design: How to Step Out of the Past to Create a Business Fit for the Future. And that involves a lot of those themes that we've been talking about today on the programme. And if what we have discussed does particularly resonate with you and you have a comment to leave with us directly, then you can do that via leaderscouncil.co.uk/contact-us. Or you can even apply to be on the programme yourself and share your perspective on this or any other topical matter or issue. And that would be via leaderscouncil.co.uk/apply if you wanted to do that. For now, it has been my immense pleasure to welcome Mark Wilson, CEO and Managing Partner at Wilson Fletcher, onto today's show. Mark, once again, thank you for your time. And to all of our listeners, I've been your host, Scott Challoner, today. And until next time, when we'll be back with a whole new perspective on leadership and current affairs, please do take care all, and goodbye.